Hi, and welcome to our fourth and final holiday webinar for our rabbinic community throughout the world. This webinar will focus on Shavuot as we strive to provide you with resources and rabbinic enrichment for you and your community. My name is Maytal Friedman, and I'm the Muslim Leadership Initiative Alumni Director here at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. For those of you who have yet to be introduced to MLI, which is now in its 5th year, I'll share a few words about the program. MLI strives to transform Muslim-Jewish relations in North America by inviting emerging Muslim leaders in America and Canada to study about Jews, Judaism, and Israel. And the inverse inevitably occurs. The Jews who meet these Muslim leaders learn about Islam and the Muslim American experience. We aim to talk about the most contentious issues, and by doing that, build sustainable and sophisticated relationships that can endure difficulty and disagreement. On this webinar, we will hear from Yossi Klein Halevi, who is the co-founder and co-director of the Muslim Leadership Initiative, and also senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. He'll be in conversation with Haroon Moghul, who is an alumnus of the first cohort of MLI, and also the fellow in Muslim-Jewish relations here at the Institute. Today, they will model the type of rich and meaningful conversations that have become the lifeblood of MLI. Today is also Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day of the Omer. And since the second night of Passover, we have been counting up. We have been counting up towards Shavuot, from Passover, which commemorated liberation, to Shavuot, which commemorates us becoming a people, the revelation and receiving the covenant. And as we prepare for Shavuot, we think about the implications of that day and that moment for us today. Yossi will share with us themes that will illuminate the relevance of that moment and speak about his new book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. We look forward to also hearing questions from you, and you can do that by posting them on Facebook if that's how you're watching the film, and I'll come back on at the end to share questions from the audience. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Yossi and Haroon.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Haroon Moghul. Thank you, Maytal, for a very kind introduction. Yossi, it's an honor to be here.
Honor is mutual.
I wanted to start with an anecdote, actually. We met a couple days ago, and you ended up speaking at Columbia, and you met one of my students at Columbia, and he came up to me very excited the next day in class and told me all about your talk. And he said that he was fascinated by what he'd heard, and he'd never engaged or met or read anyone like you. And he said that he was fascinated by the fact that you refused to conform to stereotypes or boundaries, that you were a truly original and challenging thinker. And I think that's very true, so it's an honor for me to be here and
thank
to get
you,
to talk to you about that.
Haroon, and really back at you. I feel exactly the same way about you.
So thank you. So when you told me, you were writing this book, I have to admit I was a little bit worried for you. It's like you were tackling a pretty tough topic, and of course you live this every day. But it's difficult terrain, it's difficult territory. And I have had the chance to read the book, as you know, in advance. It's extraordinarily powerful, I will say that. And it covers a lot of ground, and what we wanted to talk about today here was exactly as Maytal said, was Shavuot, was revelation, was peoplehood, and hopefully to illuminate some of the things you do so well in the book, which is to share a very intimate and vulnerable perspective on Jewish life and belief and peoplehood to an interlocutor who is presumed to be Muslim. And so I wanted to explore that conversation a little bit more deeply, but I wanted to start with a more general question and ask you, it's been about 5 years since we've been on the journey of MLI together, which is kind of hard to think about in retrospect. It's a long time. When did this idea of writing of these letters come to you?
The truth is I don't know. In some sense, I feel like I've been writing these letters for years. And I do remember that when I was working on my last book, like Dreamers, which took me 11 years and was kind of the dark night of the writer's soul. It just went on, and I didn't see my way out of that book for years. Whenever things weren't going well, I would start writing letters to my Palestinian neighbor. And I had to, and that experience was so exhilarating in comparison to the very painful writing experience of like Dreamers, that I kept actually having to pull away from writing the letters, because I knew I had to finish like Dreamers. And I felt in some way that the letters book was the gift for me as a writer, because it was a format where, for whatever reason, I felt I could really get to a deeper place in me. And once MLI started, and I began to have Muslim partners, interlocutors, then I realized that I'm beginning to get the language right. For me, the hardest part of this book was the tone. And Jews, as I think you know, tend to speak to and about Palestinians in one of two ways. Either with anger, and what about that, and you did that to us, and you know, you rejected this agreement, or apology. And I found myself in earlier drafts of the book veering between anger and apology. And you and others in MLI actually helped me get the tone right, which is just tell your story. Don't be angry, don't apologize, just be who you are. And treat your neighbor with respect. And so the MLI experience is really where the language of this book coalesced.
And when you're writing this and you tell yourself, I'm going to intervene in a conversation that's been going on for a very long time, what allowed you to feel comfortable doing that? To say that you wanted to enter this space and to say something different in an environment where, you know, as you and I both know, a lot of times these conversations aren't really conversations. They're just, as you said, they're people talking past each other, they're performing their identities, they're airing out their grievances, and to then say, I'm going to try to intervene here and say something is taking on a monumental task.
See, I don't think that I would have been able to do this if I hadn't had two experiences. The first was the year that I spent in the late 90s going into Palestinian society, going into mosques in the West Bank, in Gaza. And it's inconceivable to think of now, but I was invited into a mosque in Gaza, a Sufi mosque, in a refugee camp in Nusrat. And so I spent a year kind of living the Muslim year cycle and immersing and listening to people's stories and really trying to understand, and in a way borrowing the eyes of my neighbors, seeing how I looked to them. And then the second Intifada happened, and I felt I just can't do this anymore. My ability to reach out had just been exhausted. But then Imam Abdullah Antepli shows up in my life and says, let's do a project together. And then I meet all of you guys, cohort 1. And that made it possible for me to say, you know, maybe I can resume this journey. And you guys gave me the courage to say, there's no choice but to try again. Except this time, I'd say the conceit of the book, or the hope of the book, is that I will find Palestinian neighbors who will be prepared for a kind of a reciprocal relationship and listen to my story. And I'm hoping to open this up as a project. I don't see this as a book. I see it as a first step toward a conversation, a hard conversation. And I'm already beginning to get some letters from some Palestinians who I know, to whom I've shown the book, and this is what I really hope will happen.
And what did you, when you said you wanted to make this a conversation, what did you expect to hear?
A lot of anger. Beyond that, I didn't allow myself to have any expectations. And what I am hearing back is a lot of anger and also some gratitude. I got one Palestinian who wrote me said he was just overwhelmed when I wrote to him how sorry I was that his people had been shattered by my people's homecoming. And he just said that to get to hear that from an Israeli was just an overwhelming experience. And what I heard from him, which was an overwhelming experience, was I'm sorry for what was done to your people when you returned to your spiritual homeland. And I wrote to him back saying, this is exactly the kind of conversation that Palestinians and Israelis need to have. And so I'm ready in the next phase of this project to see where this goes. I'm ready to take this in any direction. And I'm hoping that we can really get to some deeper places. And that means listening to each other's narratives, because one of the things that really strikes me about, and this I think really takes us to the theme of Shavuot and being living with our history. For Muslims and Jews, history is never really past. We're contemporary with our ancestors, with our story. And so I spoke recently I was invited to speak at the J Street conference, and I went there 2 weeks ago. And somebody in the audience said, and I spoke with a Palestinian partner, and somebody in the audience said, can't the two of you just let go of the past? Let's look at the future. Let's try to resolve this thing. And Huda al-Rakub, who was my partner, both of us just instinctively shouted, no, we can't. That's a really Western way of thinking of identity. Palestinians and Israelis are not going to give up our narrative for the sake of economic prosperity. Yeah. That's not the way it's going to play out. And that's part of the problem with the way the whole failed peace process was premised on, which is, let's leave the narratives behind. You can't leave the narratives behind. And I want to hear my neighbors' stories. That's why I spent a year on that journey in the late 90s. Tell me your stories. I need to hear your stories, as painful as it is for me. I need to incorporate your pain into my narrative. And my narrative today of the conflict is much richer. It's much harder. It's much harder to hold. But I feel it's much more authentic. And I'm inviting my neighbor to have a reciprocal process. And I know it's harder for Palestinians for all kinds of reasons. I'm the victor so far. Who knows what'll happen? But so far, my side are the victors. The Palestinians are the losers in this conflict. And it's always easier for the victor to be more nuanced, more generous. But I'm at least hoping that some Palestinians will be willing to hear my story. And I'm not asking for agreement, just as I don't have to agree with my neighbor's story. But that's my neighbor's story. And in the Middle East, your story is who you are.
Yeah. One of the things that I found so interesting about the book is that it's deeply suffused by a Jewish life. And so I can imagine that behind every word, there are a lot more words that to a Jewish audience would be implicit, even explicit and obvious. Whereas to me as a Muslim reader, I'm going to miss a lot of that. And I wanted to start with, in the second chapter, in the second letter, Need and Longing, you talk about the 9th day of Av, the most terrible day of the Jewish year. And it's an interesting way to open the chapter, because we're talking about Shavuot and Meital's frame of going from Passover and liberation to revelation made me realize that to live a Jewish life is to live with an incredibly deep history. And I wonder if at times, does it feel overwhelming? And you did mention that, there is a Western sense of, look to the future. It's a very American narrative. We leave the past behind. We're a nation of immigrants, that kind of thing. And Jewish life is deeply infused by history. And I'm sure in many ways that has to be deeply ennobling and empowering. But in many ways, does it ever feel like you get lost in the middle of all of that?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it's interesting because I struggled with beginning the story with Tisha B'Av. I said, do you really want to start there? Passover, Shavuot, And in the end, I felt that in this conversation with my Palestinian neighbor, I need to begin with the moment that really began the countdown to what we call the Jewish return. And it began with the first Tisha B'Av, began 2,000 years ago. And so I needed to set that story. If I was telling the story to a different audience, then maybe I would have begun it differently. But I also felt the need to explain what I mean by, in the book, I refer to Zionism as the meeting point between need and longing. And the story of the Zionism of need is something that's been told over and over again. It starts with the pogroms in Russia, it ends with the Holocaust. I'm trying to tell a different story, which is the story of longing, of a 2,000-year religious story of a people that insisted on remaining vicariously indigenous through a series of rituals by refashioning their religion to incorporate the seasonal cycle of the land of Israel wherever they were. And so that's the story I'm trying to tell. Does the history ever get overwhelming? All the time. And look, I'm, as you know, I'm the son of a Holocaust survivor. And I would say, what defined my growing up was the decision to not be framed by the Holocaust and to not be a contemporary of my father's, and to realize, I live in the most privileged generation of Jews in history. My father lived in the least privileged generation of Jews in history. And the gap between his experience and my experience should really be measured by centuries. And so I would say that the Jews are a profoundly disoriented people. And the question of history, what makes history so overwhelming for my generation, is that we don't know. Who are we? What are we? Are we the most vulnerable generation of Jews, or are we the most powerful generation of Jews? And my answer is certainly emotionally, psychologically, yes to both, simultaneously. And our politics are determined. What a particular Jew's politics are is determined by how you navigate that question. Are you the least privileged Jews in history or the most privileged? So on the right, they're still in that state of mind of, wait a minute, something just happened. 70 years is nothing for peoples of memory. We're contemporary with the Holocaust. And other Jews are saying, well, wait a minute, 70 years still. Look what's happened since in the last 70 years. So history, living with history, is on the one hand really overwhelming. On the other hand, it's an exhilarating process because to try to navigate your identity, especially in this time, I feel this is the most important moment in Jewish history. And maybe Jews always felt that at every generation.
Why? Why is that?
Because we are living at a time where the great Jewish dreams and nightmares have mostly happened. For 2,000 years, Jews carried two great dreams, or three great dreams, and one great nightmare. The great Jewish dreams were that the Messiah would come. That hasn't happened yet, so let's put that aside. The other great dream was that the Jews would one day return to this vicarious homeland. And the other was that if that doesn't work out, then we'll at least find some safe refuge somewhere where we can really unpack our psychological suitcase. And the great nightmare was that one of these days we're going to really just get on the nerves of our neighbors, and they're just going to have a final solution. And except for the coming of the Messiah, all those dreams and that great nightmare have happened. And we're living in the aftermath. So I think our generation of Jews is suffering from a kind of excess of history. And look, there are times, Haroon, where I feel that I can't carry this story another moment. And I need out. I need a vacation from the Jewish experience. It's so relentless. And other times I feel, what a privilege, you know.
So you mentioned in the book, and I'm going to jump a little bit because there's so much here. You mentioned prophecy is given to Jews only in the land of Israel. And you're talking about how, you know, these dreams have come true. There is this society that your father's generation probably could have never conceived of. What does it mean to say then that prophecy is given in the land of Israel? Does that mean that it happens now? Is there something qualitatively different about Jewish life now than in any time in the last 2,000 years?
Look, that's a big question that is being asked in parts of the Orthodox community. And in terms of how significant should this be? Now, the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim, most of them say this has no religious significance. This is a political state. The religious opposition of the ultra-Orthodox to the state has almost, for the most part, dissipated. And the ultra-Orthodox today are ready to make their peace with the state, though you do have a minority that opposes it. Within the religious Zionist camp, the modern Orthodox camp, call it what you will, there's a real split. And part of that world, especially the settlers, the religious Zionist settlers, their argument is that this is the messianic moment. And therefore, the return to the land needs to change us as a people. My critique of them spiritually is that they have taken what should have been an internal spiritual transformation and politicized it completely, and done so in an extremely divisive way. So I think they've missed a tremendous opportunity for asking the kinds of questions that we try to ask at the Hartman Institute, which is, okay, we have power now. What does that mean in terms of Jewish ethics? What does it mean in terms of Judaism? How do we practice our Judaism in a sovereign Jewish state? What's different? And the ultra-Orthodox aren't asking that question because the sovereign Jewish state doesn't have religious significance for them. Yeah. They've been in exile for so long that they have, in a sense, become a religion of exile. Mm-hmm. And the other part of religious society has become so politicized, has taken the state in such a political way. And so there's the Hartman Institute and the space we're trying to hold, and it's a very hard space to hold.
So if I ask you then, is it different being Jewish in Israel than elsewhere? And when I say different, is there, and I know this is a loaded question, is there a quality to your faith or your connectedness or your experience of the divine that you can only have in Israel?
It's a great question, you know, and I think that Jews are struggling with that question today. Many Jews, certainly many American Jews, would say God is everywhere, and that's obviously true. But I do believe that certain places have particular characteristics. If you're in finance, New York is really the place to be. If you're interested in the sacred, well, we know that there are capitals around the world of the sacred. And that's where people who have spiritual inclinations tend to go. So there is, in that sense, you know, the question about a holy place or a holy land is it intrinsically holy, or is it rendered holy by the expectations and prayers and devotion that millennia of pilgrims bring to these places. And my answer is both. I feel very strongly that there is an intrinsic holiness to our sacred spots, and that intrinsic holiness has been augmented by the centuries of devotion. So if you're asking me, what is it like for me to be a religious Jew in Jerusalem, in the land of Israel? There are two aspects. One is the sense of treading softly. And one of the, I love the vitality of secular Israel. I'm amazed at what it says about the ability of the Jewish people to reclaim life. I revere it, but I'm also very worried about secular Israel and its tendency to trivialize the sacred. And the great dare, that the Zionist movement did, and this is something that we have not resolved, is how do you create a secular state in a land that you consider holy? How's that going to play out? And Israel's secular religious tensions are really expressions of that. So, and then there's living as a Jew in Jewish public space, living as a Jew with the calendar, the sense of being part of the rhythm. And I remember growing up in Brooklyn in an Orthodox family, and every fall Sukkot would come along, and you build a booth. But it always rained, and it was always miserably cold, and we could never sit in the damn booth because it was meant to be somewhere else. That's how the ritual began. But on the other hand, it was incredibly powerful to connect yourself, however awkwardly, to this distant seasonal cycle. So now, being in Israel, I feel there's a certain wholeness, and I do feel more whole as a Jew there. There's no question about it.
So then I want to build on that and ask you a few questions. You talk about how the Jewish people receives revelation. We talked about this a couple days ago as well. That Shavuot is not the receipt of revelation to a person, but to a people, and in that act it creates a people. What then does that mean for Jewish life in Israel? Does that mean that God is now invested in Jewish affairs in a different way? Does it mean that your experience of Judaism has to change, or that it can change? Because you do mention, and I just want to build on this, you have a passage that's interesting. You write that in the wake of the exile, the synagogue became a substitute temple, prayer a substitute for animal sacrifices, a major step forward. Are those steps now irrelevant? Should you go backwards? Is there something different that needs to be done?
Look, you're touching on one of the most sensitive areas.
That's why I'm asking the question.
Exactly right. So, look, there's one part of the Jewish people. Again, I'd say the group that tends to be more identified with the settlers, who would say, absolutely, that was a temporary holding measure. And I deliberately use that language in the book to say this was a step, an evolutionary step forward, a spiritual evolutionary step forward. And that was what you're picking up on is a perhaps not so subtle dig at those of my brothers and sisters who would like to rebuild a temple now, for example. Which happens to be the site of another sacred space for another faith. And for us to be playing with that on that ground, to my mind, is spiritual suicide. It's political suicide, but more profoundly, it's spiritual dynamite. And I force myself to not long for the temple. I have put the temple in deep freeze. And I think a lot of Jews have done that.
Do you think it's wrong for them to long for the temple?
I think look, it's dangerous. And it's dangerous and again, I'm speaking spiritually now, because it puts us in a collision course with Islam. And that is, and again, let's leave the political consequences aside for a moment. As painful as it is, there has to be some way in which we acknowledge that we haven't been there for a long time. And that void didn't remain a void. And another people, we talk about revelation, Islam had a kind of revelation there, right? I would say that's what my understanding of what the night journey of the Prophet Muhammad meant was that there was a revelation here. Is that a fair way to describe it?
Yeah.
So it's good that we're talking about the temple today, because part of I feel the evolution of religion generally in this time is to recognize that we need to make space for other faiths, and especially in the very complicated relationship of Judaism and Islam, where we have overlapping revelations or competing revelations. I do not want to touch the Muslim revelation. I don't want to go near that. And so if you're asking me, do I think that it's wrong to long for the temple? I think it depends how one longs. If one longs for the Messianic era and you long for a restoration of a space in which God encounters the people of Israel, then I have that longing. I don't want to give it a specific address just yet.
Yeah.
But if you long for the temple in a way that's connected more immediately to our return home, then you're opening the door to really, really profound problems.
So I want to go off of that, because there's something you said that was so interesting, and it's one of the, I think, challenges for a Muslim audience in understanding Judaism as a religion, because it has features that we recognize as similar to our experience and then that we don't recognize. And so you write, because Judaism is intended for a specific people, it can accommodate the validity of other faiths. And yet, what I would complicate that with is that, and obviously I can't argue with you about Judaism.
Go ahead.
Why not? Right? I've been here long enough. Right? It's like almost 2 years. So now I'm an expert. Judaism is intended for a specific people, but you, like Muslims and Christians, we worship one universal God. So there is embedded in that very particularity universality. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about how that tension plays out, just like every religion has its tensions. And then the second thing is, when you say accommodate the validity of other faiths, I want to challenge you on that, because that's a loaded statement. What does it mean to say another faith is valid? How do you see other faiths, and how do you see their connection to God?
So let me start with that. For me, my measure of whether a given faith is true or not is not theology, but devotion, devotional experience. I may disagree with the theology of a particular faith. I disagree actually with the theology to some extent or another with every faith, including my own. I think that's quite a Jewish thing.
There's a great line, I forgot who it's by. It doesn't matter what denomination you belong to, as long as you're embarrassed by it.
That's right,
Yeah.
that was Yitzhak Greenberg.
Greenberg, that's right, yeah. I love that line.
Exactly. So yeah, in a way I kind of feel that all of our theologies, to some extent, our theologies are meeting points between revelation and the human response. And so I feel that our theologies are necessarily flawed because they're carrying the human response. I actually cherish our theologies precisely because they're the human response to revelation. And I take revelation very seriously. And so because of that, though, I don't feel bound in the way that let's say, an Orthodox believer in any faith would insist that every every dotted I and crossed T of a given theology has to be in place. But the measure for me of what does constitute an authentic faith is, I'd say, two aspects. One is, does this given faith have the ability to take an ordinary person and make that person God-fearing, generous to fellow human beings, more sensitive, more conscious? And my answer is that's true for the world's great faiths, all of them. And you can see it. Does a given faith have the ability to take not an ordinary person, but an extraordinary person, and turn that person into a saint, someone in whose presence you can feel God's presence? And my answer there again is, by the accounts we have from all faiths, yes. A crucial moment for me in coming to terms with, in becoming a religious person. I grew up in an Orthodox family. I left as soon as I was able, which was already like high school, you know. And I discovered that that the kippah actually goes off, it doesn't only go on. And that was like a real moment in high school. And the moment when I began the long process of putting the kippah back on was reading a book in my 20s that was called Mystical Testimonies. And it was this amazing collection of testimonies from saints across the generations and different faiths and cultures. And what I began to realize in reading these accounts is that they're all describing a similar reality. These are people who turn themselves into kind of test cases for, is God real? If I do what my religion says, and I practice certain more intense religious experiences, will that lead to X results? And they all describe the universe of light, of love, of interconnectedness, of oneness, monotheism, not as a belief, but as an experience. Mm-hmm. And that was this transformation for me. And I said, wow, this is really interesting stuff. And if we want to tie it into Shavuot, each of these saints were describing experiences of personal revelation. And I felt God had revealed itself to these people. And we have their testimonies. And so it was just this overwhelming experience. And so, first of all, just as a human being, let's leave the Jew out of it for a moment. Just as a human being, I felt that I was in the presence of revealed truth. When I was reading these accounts, there were Kabbalists and Hindus and Sufis and Catholic monastics, and it was like they were all standing together. It was like a kind of a Sinai moment. They were all in this book, and I felt that they were speaking to me as the reader, saying, pay attention to this. This is really important. The world is not just what you can see. In fact, what you can't see ultimately is more real than what you can see. And that's what I feel all of our religions have in common, that we all believe that reality ultimately is what we don't see. That's the more powerful reality. And so in that sense, I feel that I'm part of one religion that has different denominations. But I do stand very deeply in my own denomination, which is Judaism. My denomination is not Orthodox or Reform, it's Judaism within this bigger faith. And in that denomination, I have a very particular relationship with revelation. And as you noted before, that revelation in Judaism is a national experience. The Jewish people is actually formed not when we leave Egypt. That's the prelude. That's what makes the formation of the Jewish people possible. But the people of Israel is created when we stand together at the foot of Sinai and God is speaking to this entire people. And that's the moment when we both accept the Torah, when we say, okay, we're going to live by these rituals, these laws, but it's also the moment when we're shaped as a people, and the two are interchangeable. And so Revelation creates a people, and I feel, you know, the question that I always struggled with as the son of a Holocaust survivor from the earliest age is, how did the Jews do this? How did they survive for 4,000 years? And I think there was something at that moment in Sinai that was so overwhelming, and that it imprinted on us this longing for that connection with God that has carried us for 4,000 years, and we couldn't let go of that. And the fact that that was the moment that created us as a people made it in some ways impossible for Jews to say, I'm going to end this story. I'm going to be the last Jew. You know, all right, you've carried the story for 3,500 years. I'm out of here. In our generation, that question has now been opened up again. And certainly in the diaspora, but also in Israel. What does this story mean? And for me, it takes us right back to Shavuot. It's that moment. What this story means is that's the moment that God spoke to a whole people and set us off on a very complicated historical journey.
So I want to ask you two questions, because I know we have time for audience questions as well. But I wanted to ask you two questions. One's a big picture question, and one is a very intimate question. The first is, when you talk about God speaking to a people and creating a people, and you're writing and trying to explain this to a Palestinian, how do you explain that to a Palestinian, given the history of what happened to Palestinians? Right. Doesn't that come across as suggesting that God basically pushed them aside in favor of someone else? Right. And what happens to their narrative in the process of that?
I can't say to a Palestinian that God has pushed you aside. That to me is sacrilege. It's the worst abuse of religion. At the same time, and this is the paradox that I live with, I do believe that in some fashion, God is in the story of my people's survival and our return home. And I don't know how to square that. The only way that I can try is to say, okay, you and I are now living past this history that's happened. How many more generations are we going to carry this tragedy? Can we start to figure out a way of ending it with our kids, at least? If not, maybe it's too late for us. But can we at least start reversing it? And here, I would use God and faith very carefully. I think that God and faith have a place, an essential place, in how we navigate our relationship, in the sense that both Islam and Judaism, just on the most minimal way, these are two faiths that revere life. And these are faiths that need to, in our time especially, say human life is our highest commitment. And we don't sacrifice human life in the name of religion. And so that's on the most basic level. The deeper level is trying to dredge up, and this is work that each faith needs to do, to dredge up from within our traditions, what are the elements that can allow us to justify, spiritually justify, political compromise? And what are the elements in Judaism that will allow us to say, okay, we believe God gave us this land, but there's another people there. What do we do with that? And how do we contract our claim to accommodate another people? And I believe that Islam has its work to do. And so this is really, for me, this is the challenge. And that's where God has to come in. If God comes in any other way, in a relationship between Palestinians and Israelis, then we're opening the door to sacrilege.
I have a few questions for you from our rabbis, just a few, and I think that they build on some of the conversation that you've been having with Haroon. The first one is around what happened at Sinai, which is that the Jewish people became a people. It was this great moment of unity, and a sense that there are also great divides in the Jewish people. Maybe just a few. So the question is twofold. One is, in your mind, what are some of the biggest ones, or the ones that are most dangerous for the Jewish people? And then I think there's a more hopeful side to this question, which is, how do we strive for and try to achieve and work towards greater unity?
Well, I think that for me, the most dangerous divide takes us back to a question that I didn't answer, that you had asked
Those are
earlier.
the best questions.
I was saving it for Meital's question now. And that is that how do we navigate the particularist universalist tension? And I think that if you look at Jewish history, there have been times where we handled that tension more successfully. This is not one of them. And if you look at the major divides in the Jewish people today, you can map those out roughly along the lines of particularism and universalism. Where is the locus of your Judaism? Is it in Isaiah? Is it in the vision of all the nations will come to Jerusalem to worship the one God, the universal endpoint of Judaism? Or is it in this family story that goes through, through thousands of years of a very particular identity? I feel that we are profoundly out of balance in our ability to hold the particularist universalist tension. And for me, the way that I try to navigate this is that I see the particularist commitment as the means to the universal end. The end point of Judaism is the same as the end point for Islam and the same as the end point for Christianity. It is it is revelation. It's Shavuot for all of humanity. All of humanity, and Isaiah says it, that the presence of God will fill the world as the waters of the sea, and which means that it will be tangible. And that's the intuition of all of our faiths, that we're moving, that history is a story. History has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and we're moving toward an end to the story. It's a very writerly way of thinking. Maybe that's one reason I love religion as a writer. I think that's a conversation you and I should have really for the next webinar.
Yeah.
And
you have to write another book.
And you too. so then, and that's really I think the sense of the universal goal. But what makes Judaism such a complicated dance is that the particularism, we see ourselves as a kind of an avant-garde in history, whose job is not to remake the whole world in our image, that ultimately everybody's going to become Jewish. That was never the goal of Judaism. But we see ourselves more as a kind of catalyst in history. And as a result of that, it's very hard for particularist Jews to remember, well, wait a minute, we're particularists for a universal goal, and it's very hard for Jews who are really actively longing for the universal goal to say, well, there are no shortcuts in Judaism. You don't just leap over the particularism. You don't abandon this very precious and difficult identity for the not yet tangible universal end goal. And if you look at really how we argue our politics today, for example, the mess that we're in, the divide between the Orthodox and the liberal denominations, these are all expressions of this breakdown in our ability to balance the particular and the universal. And I think Judaism works best when it is in harmony with these two elements. And we are really not working well today.
Our next question takes us back to the Muslim-Jewish relationship. You're deep into that, many, many years of building relationships with Muslims, getting to know Islam, and teaching about Judaism. And so this question is twofold. One is, what do you think Jews need to know about Muslims? What's one or two essential things? And what's the question or topic that Muslims most misunderstand or ask about Jews in your experience?
Can I defer the first question to you? What do you think Jews need to understand about Islam?
Oh, wow. I think one of the hardest things for people to understand who are looking at Islam from outside is that they tend to ascribe to Islam, I think, elements of their own tradition. And so, one of the issues, let's just give you an example, that's so different for us is that there was this guy, Abraham. He had two sons. There was some sort of problem between them, right? That's like everything was basically caused by this disagreement. And the interesting thing is that in the Muslim story of Ishmael and Hagar, our story is that Hagar is abandoned in the desert, and she raises Ishmael there, and he's discovered by an Arab tribe, and this tribe becomes kind of the foundation of Islam in this very long story. And in our story, the story of Islam is of religious figures who are constantly sent into exile and moved from place to place to place where religion unfolds in these different chapters. And so one of the things that's hardest for us to understand about Judaism is that for us, land doesn't have the same sacredness. Our story is a story of people who are exiled, and their very exile is their condition of spiritual elevation. So Muhammad is exiled from Mecca, and the focus of our spiritual life is Mecca, but even after he retakes Mecca, he never goes back. He dies in exile, and he's happy to. And so I think what I would say to a Jewish audience is precisely that sometimes we don't realize, there's so many similarities between our traditions that we don't realize the particularities that cause these misunderstandings. And so sometimes I think the hardest thing to do is to be able to step out of that and step away from that. And so just the idea of land is one example where I think many times what I think this conversation is so fascinating for is that we kind of talk past each other. Right. Because when you talk about the sacredness of the land, there's no similar resonance in Islam in quite the same way. And so we don't quite know what to do with that.
Right, right. And it's so interesting, Haroon, because when Muslims and Jews get together with all of this goodwill, we get very excited by the similarities. Oh yeah, Sharia, Halakha, Ramadan, and like Yom Kippur, almost similar.
Close.
Close. And then like the differences come in and say, oh, what do we do with that? And of course Israel, and the Middle East, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and then it just blows the whole thing up. And then, well, okay, how do we unpack that? And of course, that's what we try to do in MLI, is by saying, well, wait a minute, these two religions really do work in different ways. And it's at the particularity of Judaism, a particular land, a particular people, a revelation that's given to a particular people, which is not a revelation for the whole of humanity yet. The promise is that ultimately what happened in Sinai will, in some sense, happen to the whole world. Not that the whole world will take on the Torah and live the 613 mitzvot. That's not the premise, but that some kind of revelation will continue. And so that's really, I think, the great challenge. And that, if I may tell, that for me would be the answer to your question is, they're mirror, the responses mirror images to both. We really don't understand how the other religion works. And what we've tried to do, what we're trying to do, as the two of you are carrying in MLI, is how do we take this almost similarity and say let's celebrate where we do come together, and let's also really learn how to navigate where we don't, especially in the wider context of the profound tragedy and tensions that are dividing us today.
Yossi, as Jews prepare to learn all night on Shavuot and spend many hours preparing for revelation, for this ongoing revelation and the renewal of the covenant, and as we wrap up our webinar, I'm curious to hear from you about what you hope Jews will be learning and studying and internalizing this Shavuot, and also what revelation you hope will happen.
Wow. You know, there's this wonderful commentary from Rashi. Rashi was the great biblical commentator. Haroon, you're ready for rabbinic ordination, I'm telling you. And there's this where Rashi asks the question, why is the language of the Torah, when it speaks about the people of Israel at Sinai, why is the language suddenly in the singular rather than the plural? Why isn't it speaking of the tribes, the multitudes? And it says, and Rashi says, because they were camped with one heart and really one being. And that was the revelation at Sinai was oneness. And I think we need to really think a little more deeply about that. What does oneness mean? What does monotheism really mean? And again, this goes back to what I was saying to you earlier about what overwhelmed me in reading those mystical testimonies was that for these mystics, oneness was not a principle of belief. It was a lived experience. They had actually experienced the oneness of God. And so I would define my religious life as the aspiration to one day experience the oneness of God. And the oneness of God means that we live we inhabit separated beings, personalities. We have these temporary beings and faces and names, but we're going to give those up. And when our souls pass over, then you experience, I imagine, some form of oneness. I guess depending on what the level of one's soul is, what your state of consciousness is, but the premise of religion, certainly of all the mystics in all our faiths, is that it really is possible to experience revelation, to experience something of oneness in this fragmented, broken world. And broken in so many ways, and one of the ways it's broken is that it's broken into our individual states of consciousness where we can't naturally inhabit that state of oneness. So my prayer for, first of all, I'll start with the Jewish people, is that we really experience that sense of oneness that we experienced at Sinai, which was beginning with our own oneness as a people, standing before this tremendum, this awesome unnamed presence speaking to us, and that we take that particular experience of revelation, and that really becomes the basis of our relationship with the rest of humanity, and that we really move closer toward that moment of oneness. Because my feeling about this moment in history is that we are coming to that point where if we don't figure out some way of experiencing oneness, then the fragmentation, God forbid, can really just overwhelm us. And so we're living at a really interesting moment for humanity, where it's the first time we have the ability to destroy ourselves. And we really need revelation. We need a revelation of oneness to help us figure out how do we transcend this very, very dangerous moment? So Shavuot, I think, you know, that experience of being overwhelmed by something outside of us. That, I think, that's really what we're all praying for. So.
Yeah, Yossi, that is such a perfect ending and a perfect prayer for us to be holding with us as we take the complexity and the richness of what you both shared into the coming holiday, into Shavuot. I want to let you know that this webinar is actually the first in a series that will come to you related to Yossi's book. So Yossi's teaching this summer at RTS in July will be filmed and shared, and there will also be a book guide related to Yossi's new book. And again, I want to thank Yossi and Haroon. I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and wish you a Chag Sameach and a meaningful, inspiring Shavuot toward a greater oneness.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.